On a May morning in 1337, a priest named John Ford was walking down Cheapside, the busiest commercial street in London. Stalls on both sides, apprentices shouting prices, mud and straw underfoot. Another priest fell in step beside him and struck up a friendly conversation. Kept him talking, kept him distracted. And while Ford was nodding along to whatever this man was saying, 4 other men closed in around him in the middle of the crowd. One of them pulled a dagger about a foot long and opened Ford's throat with it. 2 more put their blades into his belly while he was going down. Then they walked away, through a street full of witnesses in daylight, and nobody laid a hand on them. Here's what makes that case remarkable, though. The coroner's jury that examined Ford's body knew everything. They wrote down the names of all 4 attackers. They wrote down the name of the priest who'd done the friendly conversation part. And they wrote down who ordered it. A noblewoman named Ela Fitzpaine, who had a long, ugly history with the dead man. The record names everyone. And then the same record quietly explains that nobody could seem to locate any of these people, that the noblewoman's brother apparently owned nothing worth seizing, and the whole thing just stops. One of the 4 was finally indicted 5 years later. That was the entire consequence for cutting a priest's throat on the busiest street in England in front of a crowd. Everything else in this video happens inside the world that case describes. A world where a jury could know exactly who killed a man and shrug. A world without police or detectives, where a stranger's identity could never be checked. Where one county never spoke to the next, and where the legal system was a door most killers walked straight through. So when we ask the question this video is actually about, whether the Middle Ages had serial killers, people who murdered again and again over years, the honest answer is that the world was almost perfectly built for them, and every so often the records let us see one. Before we get properly into it, quick hello. Welcome in, whether you're new here or you've been around a while. If you're settling in for this one, do me a favor and drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from. And a big thank you, as always, to the patrons and the YouTube members who keep this channel running. If you'd like to join them and support the channel, all the links are down in the description and in the pinned comment. Alright, back to the 14th century. The phrase serial killer didn't exist in the Middle Ages. Neither did the concept, really. A modern investigator looks at 5 strangled bodies across 3 counties and starts thinking about one man with a pattern. A medieval community looked at 5 bodies and saw 5 separate tragedies, or the work of wolves, or the devil loose in the parish, or a corpse that had climbed out of its grave, and we will get to all of those because every one of them shows up in the record. What the medieval world did have was murder, enormous amounts of it, and buried in the coroner's rolls and the court registers and the chronicles, it also had men and occasionally women whose killing went well past a tavern quarrel. Bandit captains with dozens of deaths behind them, a butcher in the Scottish mountains hooking riders off their horses to eat them, a marshal of France whose trial in 1440 put parents on the witness stand, one after another, to describe the last time they saw their children. Some of these cases sit on solid documents. Some come to us through legend that got written down centuries later. I'll tell you where each story comes from as we go, and you can weigh them for yourself. but the cases only make sense once you see the background they happened against. So that's where we'll start, with just how violent ordinary medieval life actually was, because the numbers are hard to believe the first time you hear them. A team of criminologists at Cambridge spent years translating the surviving coroners' rolls from 14th century England, the actual investigation records, written in Latin, of every sudden death a jury examined. They mapped 354 homicides across London, Oxford and York, street by street, and worked out rough murder rates for each city. London and York came out somewhere around 15 to 20 killings per 100,000 people per year. For comparison, a modern English city runs at about 1. So the ordinary medieval town was already 15 or 20 times more murderous than anything we live in. And then they got to Oxford. Oxford, in the early 1300s, was a town of about 7,000 people, and maybe 1,500 of them were students. The homicide rate the researchers reconstructed for it comes out somewhere between 60 and 75 per 100,000. Roughly 50 times a modern English city. And when you look at who was doing the killing, the coroners' rolls keep using one word for the culprits: clericus. A cleric, which at Oxford in that period almost always meant a student or a member of the young university. 3/4 of the identifiable killers were students. Nearly 3/4 of the victims were students too. The deadliest demographic in medieval England was, apparently, undergraduates. It makes a grim sort of sense once you look at the ingredients. These were young men, all of them male, mostly between 14 and 21, away from their families for the first time, out from under the watch of parish and guild, packed into a small town with cheap ale, dice, sex workers, and no adult supervision to speak of. And every single one of them carried a knife worn as everyday cutlery. The rolls mention over and over a little blade called a thwaitel, valued by the jurors at a penny, worn on the belt and used for cutting your bread and your cheese. That word eventually softened into our word whittle. A penny knife on every hip in every tavern in England, and enough drink flowing to make sure it came out. Oxford's violence also came in a wholesale size, and the town's worst day started fittingly in a tavern. On St. Scholastica's Day, February of 1355, 2 students at the Swindlestock Tavern complained about the wine. Words escalated, and one of them threw the tankard at the taverner's head. By evening, the town bell and the university bell were both ringing, calling out their respective sides, and for the next 2 days, Oxford tore itself apart. Townsmen against scholars, with countrymen pouring in from the villages to help the town's side. Armed crowds hunted students through the streets and into their academic halls, and the accounts of what followed are savage past anything a tavern quarrel explains. Halls broken open and stripped, scholars beaten to death, some chaplains, by the reports, with their scalps flayed, bodies dumped in privies and left in the gutters, around 60 of the university dead when it burned out. 60 corpses in 2 days, in a town of 7,000 over a thrown tankard. A community that could do that to itself and absorb it and carry on was not a community likely to notice a quiet subtraction of one stranger at a time. The London cases show you what daily life did with all that steel. One killing on the maps started as an argument about eel skins somebody had dumped in the street. Another began because a man urinated against the wall of the wrong house. Quarrels over a game of dice, over a debt of a few pence, over an insult nobody remembered clearly by morning. The fights cluster in the evening, after work, around the markets and the drinking houses, and they spike on Sundays and feast days, when everyone was off work and in their cups. Westcheap and Gracechurch Street, the big commercial arteries, show up on the map again and again. A knife goes in, a man bleeds out in the gutter, and the neighborhood gets pulled into the machinery we'll talk about in a minute. One footnote on those numbers, since people always ask. The criminologists who reconstruct medieval murder rates have also traced what happened to them afterward, and the line runs steadily, remarkably downhill, from medieval rates in the tens per 100,000, falling century by century, all the way to the modern European figure of around 1. The people in this video lived at the top of that long slope. Everything about how they treated death, how quickly steel came out, how much killing a community could witness and absorb without breaking stride, has to be heard with that in mind. Their normal and ours are 500 years of decline apart. Cities also had a legal rhythm to their nights shaped by what people feared. Curfew bells rang in the evening, and after they rang, the gates shut and honest folk were expected off the streets. Anyone found wandering after curfew without a good story could be arrested on that basis alone. Night walking was itself an offence. Being out in the dark with no light and no explanation made you a suspect person by definition. And the watchmen who stopped you were your neighbours doing an unpaid compulsory shift on the ward's rotation. The whole system of order rested on ordinary people that way. If you witnessed a crime or found a body, the law required you to raise what was called the hue and cry, literally to start shouting and keep shouting until your neighbours tumbled out of their houses and joined the chase. A village that failed to raise the hue, or raised it and let the man get away too easily, could be fined for it. Justice, at street level, was a crowd of amateurs running after a fleeing figure in the dark. Sometimes it worked. A pickpocket grabbed in the act at a Bedfordshire market in 1275 was in the pillory within the hour, and when they took him down, a local officer sliced off his ear before running him out of the district. Summary, brutal, and personal. Now hold that image because it defines the limits of the entire system. The hue and cry catches the man who kills in front of you. It catches the tavern stabber, the market thief, the husband standing over his wife with the poker still in his hand. It is completely useless against a man nobody sees. A killer who chose his moment, took a victim quietly, off the road, out of the parish, was invisible to the only investigative tool the age possessed, because that tool was, in the end, just eyesight and shouting. The medieval world was extremely good at punishing violence it witnessed, and almost helpless against violence it didn't. Underneath the hue and cry sat an even older piece of communal machinery called frank pledge, and it shows you how personal medieval law enforcement really was. Every ordinary male over the age of 12 was required to belong to a tithing. a group of about 10 neighbors who stood as mutual surety for each other's behavior. If one member of your tithing committed a crime and ran, the rest of you were on the hook, financially and legally, for producing him or answering for the failure. Your neighbors were, quite literally, your bail, from boyhood to the grave, and at regular sessions, the local court held what was called the view of frank pledge, to check that every man was enrolled and every tithing intact. On top of that, the Statute of Winchester ordered every walled town to shut its gates from sunset to sunrise and to mount a watch through the night, ordinary householders again, taking turns armed with whatever they had, empowered to arrest any stranger passing in the dark. A system like that binds settled people to each other with real force, and against settled offenders it worked tolerably well. But notice the phrase doing all the work, settled people. Frank pledge was a net woven entirely out of neighbors, and a man with no neighbors, no parish, no fixed anything, passed through it like smoke. The whole apparatus was blind by construction to exactly the sort of person this video is about. Next, the men whose whole job was arriving after the fact, and they might be my favorite part of this entire subject. The coroners. England invented the office in 1194, mostly because King Richard needed money and dead bodies generated revenue, and the way it worked has a strange, almost forensic dignity to it. When a body was found, in a ditch, in a well, floating in the Thames, slumped in a churchyard, the law said it had to stay exactly where it was. Nobody could move it, wash it, or bury it. The first finder was legally obligated to raise the alarm and then guard the corpse, and the community had to send for the county coroner, who might be days away. So a dead man would lie in the road in an English summer, sometimes for days under guard, going off, while a royal official rode toward him. And when the coroner arrived, he summoned a jury, 12 men at minimum, sometimes as many as 50, drawn from the neighborhood and the surrounding wards, and those men had to come and stand over the body and look at it. Actually look. That was the whole point of them. They counted the wounds. They measured them. The rolls will tell you a wound was 2 inches wide and 5 inches deep, on the left side of the chest between the 4th rib and the 5th, because a group of farmers and tradesmen knelt over a decomposing neighbor and examined him closely enough to say so. They identified the weapon if they could, and they appraised its value, since the object that killed a man was forfeit to the crown, a rule that covered knives and staffs and also, on occasion, a cart, a horse, a boiling pan, whatever had done the deed. They asked who saw what, who found him, who fled the neighborhood the same night. Then everything went into Latin on a parchment roll, and those rolls, the ones that survived, are the closest thing we have to crime scene reports from 700 years ago. Continental law took that literal mindedness one step further and put animals themselves on trial. French courts, in documented cases, formally prosecuted pigs for homicide, usually for the killing of infants, since pigs roamed medieval streets loose and unattended babies lay within their reach. In 1386 at Falaise in Normandy, a sow that had mauled a child to death was arrested, imprisoned, tried, convicted, and publicly executed by the town hangman, who was paid his usual fee for the job, and the account has her dressed in human clothes for the hanging. The entire ceremony of justice carried out on an animal in front of a crowd. Cases like it recur for centuries. A world that would hang a pig properly, with process and costs, was a world absolutely committed to answering every death with a culprit, and that commitment runs under this whole subject. A culprit had to be produced, and whether it was the right one mattered far less than that one existed. The surviving entries have a terrible specificity to them. A Bedfordshire roll from 1266 describes 3 men drinking in a Bedford tavern one evening, up near a shuttered window, and then leaving together at bedtime. Out on the King's Highway toward Goldington, a quarrel started. 2 of them turned on the third, and one drove a sickle knife into his heart, and the jurors record that he died on the spot, right there on the road home. Another entry from 1380 preserves an actual confession. A servant named John Taverner admitted before the sheriff and both county coroners that on a December night, he and another servant came into their master's hall at Goldington, while the man, William Picard, was sitting in his chair by the fire. Taverner hit him in the head with an axe hard enough that Picard fell into his own hearth fire, and while he lay there, the second servant finished him with a table knife to the heart. And then Taverner added one more detail, that the master's own wife had arranged the whole thing and let them in. An axe in the dark, a man burning in his own fireplace, and the person who opened the door to the killers sleeping in the same house. That, page after page, is the texture of these documents. York's rolls, from the same mapping project, add their own flavour of grim. York in the later 1300s was booming, wool and trade money everywhere, and its murders track its workshops. Knife fights among tannery workers, fatal brawls between rival glove makers, craftsmen of the same trade killing each other in the streets where they competed. And scattered through the rolls of every county, among the stabbed and the bludgeoned, come the children. Toddlers drowned in the open wells that stood in every yard, infants dead in ditches, small bodies pulled out of mill ponds and rivers, each one dutifully examined by the same juries. Most were accidents, and the rolls record them as accidents, a world without fences or supervision harvesting its youngest constantly. But an infant's body tells a jury even less than an adult's does. Suffocation shows nothing. A deliberate drowning and a stumble into the same water produce the same little corpse. Church courts, not coroners, handled most suspicions around infant deaths in the home, quiet cases, quiet penances, and historians who work on medieval infanticide will tell you plainly that the true scale of it is unrecoverable. The records around dead children are soft, exactly where you'd want them firm, and any adult in that world who understood as much, and it took no genius to understand, knew where the safest killing lay. 2 things about those rolls, though, before we move on. First, they have holes in them, enormous holes. For London, Whole runs of years are just gone, lost, rotted, burned, misfiled at some point in 7 centuries, so that what survives covers scattered fragments of the early 1300s and nothing else. Everything we can count is a sample from a much larger and darker whole. And second, even where they survive, the jurors were guessing more often than we'd like. One of the Cambridge historians on the mapping project put it bluntly, that in many cases the jury probably named the right man, and in others it was 2 + 2 makes 5, a dozen farmers standing over a swollen corpse, pooling gossip. No fingerprints, no blood typing, nothing. If the neighborhood had already decided who did it, that name went on the roll. And if the neighborhood had no idea, if the dead man was a stranger and the killer was long gone, the roll says so in a phrase that comes up again and again: slain by persons unknown. That phrase appears constantly across the surviving rolls, and every single instance of it is a door nobody ever walked through. So say the jury did name a man, say they got it right. What actually happened to him? This is where the medieval justice system stops resembling anything we'd recognize, and it decided, more than anything else, how a repeat killer could survive in this world. So let me walk you through the escape routes one by one and count how many of them were completely legal. The first and most popular option was simply running. The overwhelming majority of medieval killers, and I mean the overwhelming majority, fled the moment the deed was done and were never seen again. English law's answer to a fled suspect was a process called outlawry. The court summoned you 4 times to successive county sessions, and when you failed to appear the 4th time, you were formally declared outside the law. An outlaw lost every legal protection. In the early period, anyone could kill him on sight without penalty. He carried what the old phrase called the wolf's head, meaning his life was worth what a wolf's was: nothing. Sounds ferocious. In practice, it was an admission of defeat. Declaring a man an outlaw was the system announcing that it could not find him and had stopped trying. He walked into the next county, where nobody knew his face, gave a different name, and started over. No papers existed to contradict him. No description of him traveled faster than a man on foot. England in 1300 had maybe 4 or 5 million people, and exactly 0 of what we would call identification. A murderer's whole disguise was distance, and if he was caught, if the hue and cry actually ran him down, or he was arrested at the scene with the knife still wet, his odds were still remarkably good. The historians who've gone through the jail delivery records, the trial records, have counted the outcomes, and homicide juries in medieval England acquitted somewhere between 83 and 88% of the defendants in front of them. Between 1 in 8 and 1 in 5 accused killers was convicted. Part of that was sympathy. The jurors were the defendant's neighbors. They knew him. They knew the dead man, and they'd often already decided among themselves whether the killing was understandable. Part of it, and I find this genuinely fascinating, seems to have been fear for their own souls. A guilty verdict in a homicide case meant a hanging, and legal historians have argued that jurors flinched from that, worried that sending a man to the gallows made them party to his death when they answered for their lives before God. So they acquitted, overwhelmingly. The one punishment on the books for murder was death, and the practical effect was that almost nobody wanted to impose it. Even the minority who got convicted or who waited for trial faced a justice system with a grim intermediate stage that killed plenty of them before any verdict could. Medieval prisons served one purpose: holding men until trial. Sentences of imprisonment barely existed. Jails were holding pens where you waited, sometimes a year or more, for the justices to arrive on circuit and empty the place in a session called jail delivery. And the waiting itself was lethal. Prisoners paid their jailers for food, for bedding, for the privilege of lighter irons, and those who couldn't pay lay chained in the dark on stone, in their own filth, through the winter, packed against each other, and fever went through those rooms like fire through thatch. The records note it constantly, almost casually: died in prison before delivery. For a poor man, arrest could amount to a death sentence issued before any trial, while a man with money ate his jailer's best dinners and waited in comparative comfort for a jury of his neighbors to acquit him. The system managed to be lethal and toothless at the same time, and both qualities pressed in the same direction, against the poor and in favor of anyone with coin or connections. Then come the loopholes, and the loopholes are where this gets almost comical, except that every one of them put killers back on the roads. A man being chased could run into any church, and the moment he crossed the threshold, he was in sanctuary. Nobody could touch him there. He had up to 40 days inside, fed, under the protection of the church, while the neighborhood he'd just robbed or widowed stood outside watching the door. And at the end of those 40 days, he had a choice: surrender and stand trial, or take the other option, the one thousands chose: confess his crime to the coroner at the church door, swear an oath on the Gospels to abjure the realm and leave England forever. The coroner assigned him a port, usually the nearest one, and off he went, on foot, bareheaded, dressed like a penitent, carrying a little wooden cross, required to stay on the King's highway and keep moving. If he strayed off the road, anyone could lawfully take his head. If he made it to the port, he took the first ship out and was gone, a confessed killer, alive, free, and somebody else's problem. Continental Europe received a steady trickle of these men for centuries, and plenty of them never boarded any ship at all. They walked a day or two down the highway, waited for a quiet stretch, stepped off into the trees, and reappeared 3 counties away as a stranger with no past. The records complain about exactly this. Confessed murderers, self-admitted, sworn, simply dissolving back into the country they'd promised to leave. Beyond the 40-day parish sanctuary stood something stranger still, the great chartered sanctuaries, a handful of privileged precincts attached to famous churches, held ancient rites of permanent refuge, no 40-day clock, no forced choice. A wanted man who reached one could simply stay, for years, for life. At Durham, fugitives hammered on a great bronze knocker on the cathedral door, a snarling face with a ring in its mouth that you can still see today, and watchers posted in a chamber over the door let them in at any hour of the night, and the church recorded their names and their crimes in a register, killers prominent among them. Places like that filled up. Whole little colonies of admitted criminals lived inside sanctuary boundaries in the middle of English towns, working, marrying, walking to the invisible line at the precinct's edge and no further, while the relatives of the people they'd killed lived a street away. The victims' families could see them. Everyone could see them. The line held anyway for centuries, and the ordinary people of those towns absorbed one more lesson about how far justice reached and where exactly it stopped. Sanctuary wasn't even the strangest exit. If you could convince the court you were a cleric, you could claim what was called benefit of clergy and be handed over to the bishop's court instead of the king's. And the bishop's court did not execute anyone. Church law forbade it from shedding blood. And the test for whether you counted as a cleric was, of all things, literacy. Specifically, whether you could recite a verse of scripture, and in practice, the courts used the same one almost every time, the opening of Psalm 51. Miserere mei, Deus, have mercy upon me, O God. Every criminal in England knew exactly which verse it would be. Men who couldn't recognize a single letter memorized those lines the way you'd memorize a door code, and the verse picked up a nickname that says everything, the neck verse. Recite it correctly, and your neck stayed unstretched. A killer with a good memory faced at worst penance and a church prison, and church prisons had a way of releasing people. And above all of it sat the king, selling mercy by the sheet. Royal pardons for homicide could be bought straightforwardly for money, and in wartime they could be earned even more easily by showing up. When Edward III needed men for his campaigns in Scotland and France, his government issued pardons to indicted felons, killers included, in exchange for a term of military service, and it issued them by the thousand. The army that fought at Crécy in 1346 marched with a substantial population of men who were, on paper, murderers, and who came home with clean slates and combat experience. We're going to see one of England's most notorious criminals do exactly this, twice, and die peacefully in his bed. The Crown's position, in effect, was that a man who could kill was a man worth having, and the paperwork could be adjusted. One more escape route, the grimmest of the lot. A captured man facing certain conviction had a final card called Turning Approver. He confessed everything, and in exchange for a stay of execution, he accused his accomplices, appealed them formally, one by one, and the Crown pursued the men he named. As long as his accusations kept producing trials, he kept breathing. Some approvers named a dozen men, 20, whoever they'd ever worked with, and a few they possibly invented. It rarely saved them in the end. Most approvers eventually hanged anyway, once their usefulness ran out. But it means some of our best confessions from the period, detailed accounts of robbery networks and murder after murder on the roads, come from doomed men buying weeks of life, one accusation at a time. You have to weigh every word of those confessions, knowing the man speaking was bargaining with his own noose. One more wrinkle on the approvers. An appeal made by an approver could be settled by battle. If the man he accused denied it, the two of them, confessed felon and alleged accomplice, could be sent into a ring to fight it out with matched weapons, the outcome standing as God's own verdict on the accusation. A murderer already condemned out of his own mouth, dueling his way through his former friends one at a time, buying another month of life with every man he beat, because a victorious approver's accusation was proven and the loser hanged. The Crown supervised this. It was procedure. Add it all up and follow a single hypothetical killer through the system. He kills a stranger on the road. Odds are enormous that nobody ever connects him to it at all. The body turns up days later, slain by persons unknown, and the 100 pays a fine. Say he's suspected. He runs, gets outlawed, becomes a new man 2 counties over. Say he's caught. His jury acquits him 5 times out of 6. Say the evidence is overwhelming. He reaches a church, abjures, and walks away down the highway with a wooden cross. Or he recites the neck verse. Or he waits for a war and buys a pardon with service. Or he turns approver and hangs his friends before he hangs. Every single fork in that road favors him. Now run that same man through the system not once but 10 times, over 15 years, in 8 different counties that never once spoke to each other. That's the shape of the problem. The medieval world didn't fail to catch its serial killers so much as it never possessed a single tool capable of noticing they existed. Now, on to where such men actually did their work, because it mostly wasn't in the towns, it was on the roads between them. Travel in the Middle Ages meant exposure. You left the walls of one town, and until you reached the walls of the next one, you were a slow-moving object carrying everything you owned, on a track running through forest and heath where nobody lived and nobody watched. England took the danger seriously enough to legislate against the landscape itself. The Statute of Winchester in 1285 ordered that along highways between market towns, the brush and undergrowth be cleared back 200 feet on either side of the road, specifically so that robbers would have nowhere to crouch. 200 feet. Parliament measured out the ambush distance of a man with a knife and tried to deforest it. That statute is a confession, really. It shows the roads were understood, at the highest level of government, as hunting grounds. Where the roads climbed into real wilderness, the toll got institutionalized. The great Alpine crossings, the passes every merchant and pilgrim bound for Rome had to thread, killed travelers so reliably, by weather, by terrain, and by the robbers who worked the approaches, that the church built permanent rescue stations on them. Hospices staffed by monks whose calling was collecting the living off the mountain and the dead as well. At the Great St. Bernard Pass, the hospice kept a morgue, and because the ground up there was rock and the air was ice, the unclaimed dead didn't decay. They dried. Travelers who died nameless on the pass were stood or laid in that building, leathery, preserved, waiting decades in case someone someday came through who could put a name to a face. Visitors described the room well into the modern era, generations of the anonymous dead of the road, standing in rows. No image in this whole subject says it plainer. The medieval world knew its roads consumed people, knew it so well that it built a permanent lost and found for the bodies, and still, most of the missing never even made it to that room. And think about who was actually out on them. Pilgrims heading for Canterbury, for Santiago, for Rome, often carrying the savings for a once-in-a-lifetime journey. Chapmen and peddlers, walking merchants with a pack full of goods and coin from the last 3 villages. Harvest labourers migrating with the seasons. Carters, drovers, messengers, students walking to Oxford. clerks between posts. Pilgrims travelled in groups for safety above everything. Chaucer's little band riding out together was standard practice dressed up as sociability. And one fact governed every traveller on that list. Nobody at either end of the road knew their schedule. A peddler who set out from one village and never reached the next simply never arrived anywhere. His family, if he had one, might be 100 miles away, and would wander for a year before they knew anything was wrong, and there was no one to write to, no one to ask, no mechanism at all for connecting a worried wife in Kent to an unidentified corpse in a Nottinghamshire ditch. The road ate people, and it was very good at swallowing the evidence. English law even had a fiscal institution built directly on top of the anonymous roadside dead, and I find it one of the most quietly revealing things in the whole period: the murderum fine. It came in with the Normans, and the rule ran like this. When a slain body was discovered and the killer was unknown, the entire 100, the whole administrative district, owed a heavy collective fine to the Crown, unless the community could formally prove the dead man was merely English rather than Norman. Set aside the ethnic accounting, which faded over time. Look at the underlying assumption. The law took it for granted that murdered strangers would keep turning up with no name and no killer, so routinely, so predictably, that the sensible response was to build a permanent tax around the phenomenon. Secret homicide, the corpse in the ditch with no story attached, was so ordinary that it had its own revenue stream. Whenever anyone tells you the medieval village was too tight-knit for a killer to operate unseen, the murderum fine is sitting there in the law books, disagreeing. Some of the men working those roads, though, were far past the lone robber stage, and the records occasionally give us a whole organization in daylight. The best documented in England is a family firm. The Folvilles of Ashby Folville in Leicestershire. They were gentry. That's the first thing to get straight about them. Their father was a knight and lord of the manor, and when he died, the eldest son took the estate and the 6 younger brothers got, essentially, their horses, their weapons, their name, and no future. 4 of them, under the second brother, Eustace, turned the family name into a criminal enterprise that ran through the 1320s and 1330s across Leicestershire, Rutland, and the surrounding counties. Robbery, extortion, kidnapping for ransom, and murder for hire. And one of the most active members of the gang, I have to tell you, was a priest. Richard de Folville was rector of the little church at Tay in Rutland, an ordained man of God with the care of souls, and the chronicler Henry Knighton, who knew this country and these stories, describes him as a savage and audacious man, and names him a captain among the brothers when the violence got serious. Their first famous killing came in January of 1326. Sir Roger de Bela, a baron of the Exchequer, a senior royal official, and by most accounts a spectacularly corrupt one, who'd used his office to squeeze his neighbours, the Folvilles among them. He was riding from Kirby Bellars toward Leicester on the road near Rearsby, with his household around him, when an armed party came out of the morning and cut him down in the highway. Eustace de Folleville was in it, so were several of his brothers and the sons of another local lord, the La Zouches. This was less a robbery than a coordinated local execution of a hated official carried out by the sons of two knightly houses in broad daylight on a public road. The killers rode to the coast and crossed to France, outlaws now, and if the story ended there, it would just be a political murder. It doesn't end there. It barely even pauses. Because in 1329 they were pardoned. All of them. The regime had changed in London, and the new government wiped the slate in exchange for military service. The brothers came home, put on the king's colours, and within about a year were robbing the very town they were garrisoned in, and the pardon was revoked, and they went straight back to the life. Through these years, the gang worked constantly. They robbed travellers. They extorted what they politely framed as protection. They took money to commit crimes for respectable clients, and one documented contract from 1331 shows exactly how respectable. 2 churchmen paid the brothers £20, serious money, to go and wreck a watermill belonging to a rival religious house. Monks hiring outlaws as a demolition service. Everyone in the county knew who the Follevilles were and what they did. The county, by and large, found them useful. Their masterpiece came in January 1332, and the victim this time was the law itself. Sir Richard Willoughby, a justice of the King's Bench, one of the most senior judges in England, was riding near Grantham when the Follevilles and their allies took him off the road. The indictment that survives describes what happened next in a phrase that has stuck with everyone who's ever worked on this case. They carried him from wood to wood, den to den, hideout to hideout, across the county, a royal judge dragged through the winter woods by armed men while the price was negotiated. And the price came, 1,300 marks, an absolute fortune, plus a sworn oath from Willoughby to comply with their instructions going forward. He paid. He swore. They let him go. And here's the detail that turns the whole story sideways. The chronicler recording all this can barely bring himself to feel sorry for the judge. Knighton notes, dryly, that Willoughby sold the laws like cattle. He was widely considered as corrupt as the men who kidnapped him, and years later the king's own government arrested him on exactly those grounds and made him buy his way back into favour for 1,200 marks, slightly less, you'll notice, than the Follevilles got out of him. Popular sympathy in Leicestershire did not run in the direction you'd expect. For the kidnapping of a royal justice, the Crown's response was furious, sweeping, and almost entirely ineffective. Commissions came north, inquiries were held, and the principal Follevilles were never punished for it. Not one. Eustace, the chief of the family business, with the Baylor murder, the Willoughby kidnapping, and years of robbery and at least several killings behind him, was pardoned yet again in 1333 for service in the Scottish War. He fought in the King's campaigns in Scotland and in Flanders. He was still being welcomed into respectable company at the end of the 1330s. And in 1346 he died peacefully in possession of his lands, having stood trial for nothing, and was buried in the family church at Ashby Folleville, where the village's most successful career criminal presumably lies to this day under the floor his family paid for. his brother the priest met a rougher end. By 1341, Richard de Folleville was one of the last of the brothers still actively raiding, using his own church at Tay as a base, an armed robber with a parish. A royal keeper of the peace named Sir Robert de Colville finally ran him to ground there, and Richard barricaded himself inside the church with some of his men and fought. Arrows out of the church tower, across his own churchyard, over the gravestones of his own parishioners. At least one of the pursuers died in the yard. When they finally forced the door, they dragged the rector out of his own nave and beheaded him on the spot. No trial, sword through the neck beside his church wall. And then came the aftermath, and it's very medieval. The men who killed him had committed sacrilege, violent hands laid on an ordained priest, and so Colville's party had to do public penance for it. Each of them was whipped at the doors of the local churches. The law thanked them, the church flogged them, and everyone seems to have considered the books balanced. One more thing about the Follevilles before we cross the water. 2 generations later, William Langland wrote Piers Plowman, one of the great English poems of the age, and when he wanted a phrase for rough justice, for wrongs put right outside the courts, he wrote of Folleville's laws. The name of a family of robbers and killers had become, in the language of ordinary people, a byword for rough justice taken by force. The gang had been dead for decades, and the poem assumes everyone will catch the reference approvingly. Bandits into folk heroes within living memory of their victims. This subject does that constantly, as you'll see. The record shows us men leaving bodies in roads, and the culture, given a generation or two, quietly turns them into Robin Hood. The Follevilles also had colleagues. Over in the Peak District of Derbyshire, another set of brothers, James, John and Nicholas Cotterell, ran a parallel operation through the same years, and the Cotterell gang was, if anything, more businesslike. They levied protection money across the High Peak. They murdered. They took commissions, including from cathedral clergy at Lichfield, to terrorize the right people. Chaplains and beneficed churchmen turn up on the gang's membership lists, alongside gentry and labourers, a genuine cross-section of Derbyshire society, moonlighting in organised crime. When the Follevilles needed to disappear after a big job, they hid with the Cotterells in the Peak, and when royal commissioners came hunting them there, a local informer got word to the Outlaws in time, every time. The 2 gangs worked the Willoughby kidnapping together, and the Cotterells' ending might be even more galling than Eustace Folleville's peaceful grave. No real punishment ever landed on them either, and Nicholas Cotterell, one of the principals, later shows up in the records holding royal office as bailiff for the Queen herself in the High Peak. From extortion racket to crown appointment without ever passing through a courtroom. If you were a victim of these men, and plenty of dead and ruined people were, that's the justice you watched happen. The Crown did try, in fairness, to build something bigger than the county courts to deal with men like these. Edward I and his successors sent out special roving commissions, the Trailbaston inquiries, named for the cudgel-carrying thugs they were meant to sweep up, with power to hear accusations of organized violence across whole regions, and later commissions of the same sort went straight at the Folleville and Cotterell country. The results, honestly, embarrass the effort. Juries empaneled in gang territory developed sudden collective amnesia, because every juror had a farm that could burn and a family that could be visited. Witnesses failed to appear. Local officials, some of them on gang payrolls, some of them gang relatives, mislaid orders and misdirected pursuits. The commissions would gather magnificent lists of indictments against men nobody could find, present them to the Crown and go home. And the Crown, needing soldiers more than it needed convictions, would eventually pardon half the names on the lists in exchange for service anyway. A justice system can survive corruption at the bottom or indifference at the top, but this one had both at once, plus a war on, and organized killers sat comfortably in the gap for 2 generations. Killing for hire on the grand scale had a long pedigree by then, and one early practitioner ran the full arc, monster to legend, inside a single lifetime. Eustace, called the monk, actually was one, a Benedictine out of a monastery near Bologna around the turn of the 1200s, who left the cloister over a family feud, turned outlaw, and then turned professional, selling naval violence in the Channel to whichever king was buying. For years his ships raided coasts and shipping for England against France, and then, the price moving, for France against England, and the coastal towns he worked learned to dread the name. In 1217, an English fleet finally took his flagship off Sandwich, and the victors beheaded him on the deck of his own ship. His head went round the coastal towns on a lance, and within a generation, an admiring verse romance was circulating about him, full of tricks and disguises, the pirate as folk hero. The bodies in the water had barely gone cold before the entertainment industry of the day got to work on him, the same manufacture we watched run on the Follevilles, already humming along 2 centuries earlier. Across the Channel, meanwhile, France was running the same experiment at a scale England never approached, because France had the war. The 100 Years' War ground on for over a century, and one of its ugliest mechanics is easy to miss if you only follow the battles. Every time a truce was signed or a campaign wound down, the armies didn't go home. Most of the men in them had no home worth the name. They were professional soldiers, many of them foreigners, all of them trained, armed, organized into companies under captains they trusted more than any king. And when the pay stopped, the companies simply kept operating. Same structure, same skills, new business model. They took what they needed from the countryside at sword point, and the French called them routiers, men of the bands, the free companies. For decades at a stretch, large parts of France were effectively governed by roving military enterprises, whose entire economy was extraction from the defenseless. After the Treaty of Arras in 1435 released yet another wave of them, the demobilized soldiery picked up a nickname that says everything about their methods before you learn a single detail. The écorcheurs, the flayers, the skinners. They earned it in the first place by stripping their victims of absolutely everything, down to the shirts, leaving peasants naked on the winter roads. And the complaints and chronicles from these years, Fill in the rest of the picture. Bands would descend on a village and work through it house by house, and the working assumption was always that the peasants had coin buried somewhere. So the écorcheurs asked, and the asking was done with fire. Villagers held over their own hearths until they gave up the hiding place, men strung up by the thumbs from their own roof beams. Feet roasted. Wives and children worked on in front of husbands who'd already sworn, truthfully, that everything was gone, because the previous company through had taken it. And when a village truly had nothing left, that discovery arrived too late to help anyone in it. Then the band moved on to the next village, and the next, for years. Captains grew famous at this. A Castilian soldier of fortune named Rodrigo de Villandrando operated across whole provinces with such thoroughness that chroniclers hung titles on him, Emperor of Pillagers and simply the Flayer, and he ended his days wealthy, respectable, and titled in Spain. The generation before the écorcheurs had already shown what the companies could do at their boldest. After the peace of 1360 briefly stopped the official war, the discharged soldiery coalesced into great bands that moved like armies. And in the last days of that same year, one such force seized the fortified town of Pont-Saint-Esprit, sitting on the Rhône directly upstream from Avignon, where the Pope himself held court. The company installed itself in the town, plundered it, held the river, and in effect put the papacy under threat until it was paid and preached away, the Pope resorting to crusade indulgences and hard cash to move a robber army off his doorstep. Individual captains from this world became household names. The archpriest, an actual former churchman turned company commander who extracted an enormous ransom from the Pope at Avignon a few years earlier just by showing up outside it with his men. And the cruelty ran wherever the companies ran. An English chronicler records that in 1379 a royal expedition under Sir John Arundel, delayed in port, quartered itself on a convent, and the soldiers took women from the nunnery, and from a wedding they crashed, carried them aboard when the fleet finally sailed, and then, when a storm rose and the ships needed lightening, threw the women into the sea. Dozens of them, 60 by the chronicle's count, drowned by the men of a royal fleet as cargo. The chronicler tells it with revulsion, and the storm that followed wrecked Arundel too, so the story got told as judgment. For our purposes, the judgment lands elsewhere. This was the culture of licensed armed men in this era, at sea and ashore, under noble command and under none. And the line between soldiering and mass murder was, for decades at a stretch, a matter of paperwork. The scale of what the companies did to France is honestly difficult to hold in your head, so here's one witness. Thomas Bassin was the Bishop of Lisieux in Normandy, and writing later in the century about the country he had crossed with his own eyes during these decades, he described the land from the Loire up to the Somme, the heart of northern France, as abandoned. Fields untilled year after year, empty of ploughmen, growing back into scrub and thicket, because working in an open field made you visible, and visible meant dead or worse. An entire agricultural civilization pulled indoors, behind walls, for a generation. And for our subject, the companies did something quieter that no chronicler could have written down, though it follows from everything they did right. A man who enjoyed killing, who wanted it, could enlist in an écorcheur company and spend 10 years doing exactly what he wanted daily, to defenseless people, with comrades around him and a captain's banner over him, and history would file every one of his victims under war. No pattern to detect, no name to remember. And when the companies were finally broken up or hired away in the 1440s, thousands of men shaped by that decade walked back down the roads into ordinary life, past the farms, past the inns, past everyone. Paris, in the middle of all this, kept a document that lets us watch the other end of the pipeline, the moment one of these drifting men finally landed in a courtroom. It's called the Criminal Register of the Châtelet, and it survives by pure luck. The Châtelet was the great fortress courthouse prison of the Provost of Paris, and for centuries it must have generated registers like this one continuously. Exactly one survives, covering 32 months, September 1389 to May 1392, 127 cases, written up in a clean clerk's hand by a court scribe named Guillaume Cachemeret. Everything else, the rest of the series, whole centuries of Parisian criminal justice, gone. What we know about how that court worked, we know essentially through this one book. The book shows a machine built around confession. French royal justice at this level didn't rest a case on witnesses. It wanted the man's own words, and it had a procedure for getting them. Suspects at the Châtelet, most of them poor, many of them strangers to Paris, drifters, discharged soldiers, laborers between jobs, exactly the population the roads produced, were put to the question. Bound to trestles, stretched, water forced into them. Then taken down, given a meal, sometimes wine, allowed to rest, and asked to repeat the confession freely, away from the instruments, so the record could describe it as voluntary. And if the free version came out thinner than the tortured version, back to the trestles. Under this treatment, men confess to careers. The register holds accounts of years on the roads between provinces, thefts, robberies, killings, accumulated across a wandering lifetime, and now recited in order to a clerk who wrote them down in beautiful Latin-flecked French. Some of those recitations are probably true, the actual life story of an itinerant robber finally caught. Some are probably a broken man reciting whatever ended the session, and the clerk's tidy pages preserve both possibilities without a flicker, because the procedure couldn't tell the difference and wasn't designed to try. Either way, the outcome was steady. Nearly everyone in the register hangs, and they hanged at Montfaucon, possibly the single most medieval structure I know of. On rising ground northeast of the Paris walls, beside the road into the city, stood the great gibbet of the kings of France, a raised stone platform, and on it a rectangle of 16 tall stone pillars, joined at the top by heavy wooden beams, and from those beams the hanged, dozens at a time, on multiple levels. Executions happened elsewhere in the city, and the bodies were carted out to Montfaucon afterward to be hung up among the others, because the structure's real function came after death, display. The dead stayed on the beams for months, through the seasons, until the weather and the birds took them apart, and the pieces dropped into a charnel pit built underneath. Travelers approaching Paris from the northeast passed beneath this, the smell first, then the crows, then the shapes on the beams, a permanent government installation announcing the price of crime with actual bodies, refreshed regularly. Every man and woman in the Châtelet register who went to the rope ended up part of that display. It was justice as architecture, and the city lived with it, downwind, for 400 years. 60-odd years after our register, another French archive opens another window, this time in Dijon, and this one shows organized crime as a mature industry. In 1455, the town prosecutor of Dijon, a careful man named Jean Rabustel, opened an investigation into a network that called itself the Coquille, the Shell, its members the Coquillards. What his inquiry documented still startles historians. Roughly 60 men, names on paper, with specialized trades inside the organization. Picklocks, lock charmers, dice loaders, counterfeiters of coin and seals, con men working pilgrim routes, muggers and murderers, each specialty with its own name in the gang's private language. Rabustel got an informer talking, and through him the investigation recorded that language itself, an entire criminal argot, word by word with translations, a dictionary of the underworld sitting in the Dijon archives. The network's reach ran along the roads through Burgundy and beyond, exactly the arteries we've been talking about all video, and its members drifted between cities the way all our killers do. One more detail for the literature people. The poet François Villon, the greatest French poet of the century, a convicted criminal himself, wrote several ballads entirely in coquillard argot. And men from his Paris circle turn up in the network's orbit. His companion, Regnier de Montigny, finished on the Paris gallows. Murder in this world was one trade among several, practiced by professionals, inside organizations, along established routes. The lone medieval killer had colleagues, and in Dijon, for once, we can see the whole guild. Staying in France a little longer, because the same war-wrecked landscape produced a horror that has nothing to do with human hands, and yet everything to do with our subject. In the 1420s and 30s, wolves came to Paris. We know about this through an extraordinary source, a diary. An anonymous Parisian, probably a cleric attached to the university, kept a private journal through the worst decades of the war, noting food prices, weather, atrocities, gossip, whatever the city was living through, and his entries about the wolves have a matter-of-fact quality that makes them worse. In July of 1421, he records, starving wolves were coming into the villages around Paris at night and digging up the freshly buried dead to eat them. The graveyards of the war years were shallow and full, and the wolves had learned. That alone would be nightmare enough. But through the 1430s, the packs escalated. The diarist reports them ignoring sheep to take the shepherd, attacking grown men and women, taking children, and by 1439 it had become a running massacre on the edges of the city itself. In the last week of September of that year alone, he counts 14 people, great and small in his phrase, meaning adults and children, strangled and eaten by wolves in the vineyards and marshland between Montmartre and the Porte Saint-Antoine. The ground immediately outside the walls. People working their own vine rows within sight of Paris were being pulled down and consumed, 14 of them in a week, and modern attempts to total up the chronicle evidence for the years 1436 to 1440 land somewhere between 60 and 80 dead around the city. Out of those years, the Parisians assembled a villain, because human beings cannot leave a body count without a name attached. One wolf, they decided, was behind the worst of it, a big male with a bobbed tail and a reddish coat, and they named him Courteau, Shorty, more or less, and talked about him the way you'd talk about an outlaw chief, tracking his appearances, crediting him with kills across the whole region. Courteau was reported taken in 1439, and the story kept growing after him. Later accounts carry the drama forward to a famous finale in the winter of 1450. 40 Parisians dead in a single cold season, and then a pack lured through the broken city walls, herded through the streets onto the open square in front of Notre Dame itself, penned there by the crowd, and stoned and speared to death on the parvis, while the cathedral stood over the whole scene. How much of that final act happened as told? The sources make hard to say. The closer accounts give us the 1430s horrors, and the Notre Dame showdown gets more vivid the further from events the telling stands. But even the sober core is grim past belief. A capital city of Christendom, its suburbs hunted by wolves for years, its people eaten within sight of the walls. Something in how communities finished with these animals gives the whole business away. A killer wolf, once taken, wasn't just destroyed and left. The carcass got treated like a criminal, paraded through the streets in a cart so everyone could look at it. Strung up on the town gallows, sometimes, hoisted where thieves hung, displayed until it rotted. People needed the predator to have a face, a name, a sentence carried out in public, the full ritual of justice performed over a dead animal, because a tally of the eaten with nothing on the gallows at the end of it was unbearable. That need, a body count demanding a face to punish, runs straight through this next point. Now, why do wolves belong in a video about serial killers at all? Every wolf death in those records was recorded as a wolf death by people who found a body, days old, torn, scavenged, in a vineyard or a marsh. Nobody could autopsy it. Nobody could distinguish, on a corpse in that condition, the work of teeth from the work of a blade followed by teeth, because every corpse left outdoors got scavenged by something within hours. Which means that in any region with man-eating wolves in it, and late medieval France assuredly qualified, a human being could strangle a child in a vineyard, walk away, and have the death land in the wolf column, uninvestigated, unquestioned, closed on discovery. I'm not claiming any particular death in the Paris diary happened that way. Nobody can know. What we can know is that the category existed, region-wide, for centuries. An open drain in the accounting of the dead, and anything poured into it vanished. England, interestingly, had mostly killed off its wolves by this period, and so an English body in a ditch demanded a human explanation. France, Germany, the great forested stretches of the continent, kept the drain open until the modern era. The medieval mind also ran the connection in the opposite direction, and this is where the era's imagination starts doing our detective work for it, badly. If wolves killed like men, some men, everyone understood, became wolves. This belief runs deep and early, long before the famous werewolf trials of later centuries, and it sat squarely in the mainstream. Around 1210, Gervase of Tilbury, a learned courtier writing an entertainment for the emperor, states it flatly as a known feature of the world that in England men turn into wolves at the changes of the moon, and he passes on cases with names and places attached. Marie de France built one of her courtly romances around a sympathetic werewolf, a knight with a wardrobe problem. Sermons worried about it, village belief took it for granted. In a countryside losing people to something in the trees, the practical result looked like this: deaths that were probably wolves, deaths that were possibly men, and a shared certainty that the distinction might not even exist, that the thing taking children from the vineyard margins could be a neighbor at the changes of the moon. A community carrying that belief has an explanation available for any string of killings, and the explanation points away from every ordinary human suspect. The The one predator nobody in medieval Europe went looking for was a normal man. And when the deaths kept coming and no living culprit, wolf or human, could be found, the medieval world had one more suspect available, and this one takes some getting used to. They accused the dead. Our best witness here is an Augustinian canon named William of Newburgh, writing a serious, careful history of England around 1198. A man with a reputation among historians as one of the more sober and critical minds of his century. And this sober, critical man devotes a section of his history to walking corpses, because, he says, the reports of his own decade were so numerous and so well attested by trustworthy clergy that he couldn't leave them out. He gives 4 cases in detail. In Buckinghamshire, a dead man returning by night to his widow's bed, throwing his weight on her, then troubling his brothers and even the animals of the village, until the Bishop of Lincoln, consulted formally, prescribed a written absolution laid on the corpse's chest in the tomb, a bureaucratic solution, and the visits stopped. In Berwick, a wealthy man, described frankly as a rogue in life, wandering out of his grave at night with a pack of barking dogs trailing him, the town in terror, until 10 young men dug him up, hacked the body to pieces, and burned it. At Melrose, a priest who had lived for hunting, remembered as the hound's priest, prowling his old haunts until he was destroyed. And at a castle William calls Anantis, up near the Scottish border, the fullest and worst of the 4. The Anantis story goes like this, and William says he had it from the local clergy. A man of bad life took a wife, grew jealous of her, and hiding in the rafters above the bed to catch her with another man, fell, took mortal hurt, and died shortly after, unconfessed and unshriven. He did not stay down. Night after night, the account says, the corpse came out of its grave and roamed the lanes and courtyards, and a stench of corruption moved with it through the air of the town, and then people began to die. A pestilence emptied house after house, and the survivors had no doubt at all about the cause. The thing walking at night was killing the town. Families fled. The place was on its way to abandonment. And one evening, while the town's remaining elders were still gathered in council over what to do, 2 brothers, young men whose own father the pestilence had taken, went ahead and ended it themselves. They took spades to the grave, and only a little way down they found the corpse, and William describes what they saw: the body swollen, gorged, the face turgid and suffused with blood, the burial shroud shredded and wrenched about. One of the brothers struck the corpse with the edge of his spade, and out of the wound ran such a quantity of blood that, in William's words, they understood it had been filling itself on the blood of the living. So they dragged it out of the churchyard, built a pyre, tore the heart out of the body because the belief held that the fire wouldn't take otherwise, and burned the whole thing to ash while the town watched. The pestilence, William notes, stopped after that. Standing where we stand, you can see through the story to the thing underneath it. A wave of deaths moving through connected households in one small settlement, in the pattern disease moves. A community searching for the agent and finding it in the churchyard, in a man they'd already judged wicked while he lived. And the state of the corpse, the bloating, the bloody face, the burst of dark fluid under the spade, matching, point for point, what a body normally does in the ground, decomposition taken for gorging. Archaeologists digging medieval cemeteries occasionally turn up the physical counterpart of these stories: skeletons burned after burial, decapitated after death, mutilated in ways that make sense only as revenant killing. Which lands us somewhere strange. Medieval communities did hunt serial killers. They investigated, identified a suspect, and executed him with fire and dismemberment. The suspect was simply already dead, and every hour and every ounce of terror spent on the corpse was spent not watching the living, which, for any living killer who ever benefited from the cover, must have been very convenient indeed. From imagined predators to the most desperate real ones, and to get there we have to talk about hunger, because famine sits behind one of the darkest documented figures in this whole video. In the autumn of 1315, it started raining across northern Europe, and it barely stopped for 2 years. The harvest of 1315 drowned in the fields. The harvest of 1316 drowned after it. Grain prices went up 3, 4, 8 times over. The stores ran out. Then the seed corn got eaten, then the plough animals, then the dogs. Across England, France, the Low Countries, Germany and Scandinavia, people starved to death in numbers historians put in the millions. And the chronicles of those years record things their writers plainly struggled to set down. A monk at St. Albans, keeping the Abbey's chronicle, wrote of reports that parents ate their own children in those years. He also recorded something claimed about the jails, that prisoners, left to starve in the lockups, fell on newcomers thrown in among them and tore them apart half alive, devouring them. Irish annalists during the famine that came with war a couple of years later wrote with terrible plainness that the people took corpses from graves and dug the flesh out of the skulls to eat, and that women ate their children. How literally to take each report from this distance is hard to judge. Famine chronicles reach for the ultimate horror almost as a convention. But the convention existed because the thing happened somewhere, sometime, enough to be believable everywhere, and the writers of 1316 clearly believed they were living in one of those times. Scotland's turn came in the following decades. War and crop failure stacked together through the 1340s, and out of that hunger, Scotland produced a figure who has 1 foot in the chronicle record and 1 foot in the campfire, and his name was Christie of the Cleek. The earliest trace of him is close enough to the events to matter. Andrew of Wintoun, a Scottish prior, wrote a verse chronicle of his country around 1420, and covering the famine years he pauses on a man he calls Chewston Cleek. The old verse says that in a time of such scarcity that many died of hunger, this man set himself up around the fringes, and it lists his prey, children and women, and passing swains, meaning young countrymen on the roads, and he ate all that he might get. That's the seed, written within living memory's reach of the 1340s. A man in the hungry hills, trapping women and children and travellers, eating them. The later chroniclers grew the seed into a full career, and here's the shape it took by the time the 15th and 16th century versions finished with it. Andrew Christie was a butcher in Perth. When the famine bit down, his trade collapsed with everything else, and he attached himself to a band of starving scavengers scratching for anything edible in the foothills of the Grampian Mountains. One of the band died of hunger out there, and Christie, the professional, looked at the body with a butcher's eye and did what he knew how to do. He broke the corpse down and he fed the others. That was the threshold, and once the band had crossed it, they never came back. Under Christie's direction, they stopped waiting for their meals to die. They moved up into the mountain passes, the narrow tracks where every traveler between the lowlands and the north had to funnel through, and they went to work as predators, taking the riders and the horses both, meat being meat. Christie's own contribution gave him his name. He fashioned an iron hook on a long pole, a cleek, and as a rider picked his way through the pass, Christie would swing the hook out of cover, sink it into the man, and rip him out of the saddle, onto the rocks, into the reach of the band. The later accounts credit the band with around 30 riders taken in the passes this way, hooked, dragged down, butchered and eaten over a stretch of years, until enough travellers had vanished on that route that Perth raised an armed force and sent it into the mountains. The band was run down and destroyed, killed or taken and executed, and Christie himself, in every version of the tale, got away. The ending the story gives him has no document behind it, and I'm passing it along as exactly what it is, the tradition's own coda, because it's too striking to leave out. Christie Cleek slipped out of the mountains, took a new name, and walked back into ordinary Scottish life. One strand of the tradition settles him in Dumfries, married, prosperous, a respectable merchant, decades of quiet life on top of what he'd done in the passes, with the truth surfacing only at the very end, as a deathbed confession. And whatever its factual worth, Scotland believed in him for centuries. Christie Cleek became a nursery terror, a name parents used after dark. The man with the hook who takes children, wholly real to generations of Scots, the way such figures are. About 300 years later, the same country's imagination built the story again. Bigger, on the Galloway coast. Sawney Bean and his cave clan, 40-odd incestuous cannibals and 1,000 victims. A tale that first shows up in print in London chapbooks in the 1700s, centuries after its supposed events, wearing an English mocking nickname for a Scotsman as its title. The pattern of the two stories is the same skeleton dressed twice. The hidden family in the rocks, the travellers who never arrive, the salted flesh, the royal expedition. Where the second one is concerned, the paper trail starts very late and very far from Scotland, and I'll leave that where it lies. The older, smaller, hungrier story, the butcher in the passes with his hook, sits much closer to its own events, in a chronicle written by a churchman who thought he was recording his country's history. Hunger drove Christie's band up into the passes, but you didn't have to go to the mountains to disappear on a journey. Sometimes all you had to do was stop for the night, and this next fear, the murdering innkeeper, might be the most intimate one the medieval road had to offer. Think about what an inn actually asked of a traveller. You arrived at dusk in a place where nobody knew you, carrying everything of value you owned, because where else would it be? You handed your horse to the establishment. You ate what the house served, drank what the house poured, and then you went upstairs, into a room the host chose for you, in a building the host knew down to the last floorboard, and you lay down and made yourself unconscious for 8 hours. Every night on the road ended with that surrender, and travellers knew perfectly well that they'd told the whole common room, just by their clothes and their purse and their talk, exactly what they were worth. Court records across medieval Europe hold real cases of hosts who killed guests, and the fear of it soaked so deep into the culture of travel that it produced legends with astonishing staying power. And England's finest specimen hangs on a real building that is still open and still pouring pints about 20 minutes from Heathrow Airport. Medieval law, tellingly, looked sideways at innkeepers as a class. English courts developed a special rule for them, and it survives in the law books. An innkeeper was strictly liable for his guests' goods, answerable for a theft under his roof even without any proof he'd had a hand in it, a severity applied to almost no other trade. The reasoning the old cases give runs on frank suspicion that hosts and thieves were too often the same people or partners, that the man who knew which room held the fat purse was the man best placed to empty it. Continental customs pushed the same direction, requiring hosts in various towns to report their guests' names to the authorities, night by night. The whole legal category of the innkeeper was built around the understanding that travellers slept in the power of strangers with every incentive to rob them, and the leap from robbing a sleeping guest to making sure he never woke was not a long one, and everyone knew it. Out of that shared knowledge, England grew its masterpiece of the genre. The Ostrich Inn at Colnbrook sits on what was the Great Western Road out of London, and the establishment's claimed pedigree runs back to 1106. The story attached to it concerns a landlord named Jarman and his wife, placed by the tale back in the reign of Henry I, and the mechanism they were said to operate has earned its reputation. The Jarmans kept their best chamber for their richest guests, directly above the kitchen. The bed in that room was bolted to a section of the floor, and that section was a trapdoor on a pivot, worked from below by a lever. A wealthy traveller, a wool merchant, say, riding home with a season's takings, would be fed generously, plied with strong ale on the house, complimented and shown up to the good room. And in the small hours, when the house was still, Jarman pulled his lever, the floor tilted, the sleeping man slid off his own mattress, through the opening and dropped head first into what waited directly below in the kitchen, a brewing cauldron, kept at the boil. The story is precise about the reasoning, that the drop and the boiling killed a man before he could get a scream out, leaving no blood and no marks in the chamber. By morning the bed was level, the guest had ridden on early, as far as anyone could say, and his horse was on its way to being sold. The couple's private code for a suitable guest in the tale was livestock talk across the tap room. A fat pig is available, if you want one. Put him in the sty till the morrow. The tale gives them roughly 60 guests over the years and gives the ending to a horse. The final victim, a clothier from the West Country named Thomas Cole, went into the cauldron like the others, but his horse got loose from the stable and was found wandering, and people remembered Cole stopping at the Ostrich, and this time the questions didn't stop. Jarman's wife was taken. Jarman himself ran and was caught hiding in Windsor Forest. And under questioning, so the story finishes, he confessed to the 60, and the pair of them were hanged. Local tradition adds a flourish I can't resist. That Cole's body was found in the brook by the inn, and Cole in the brook gave Colnbrook its name. Now, the whole of this comes down to us through a work of popular fiction printed at the end of the 1500s by a ballad-writing weaver named Thomas Deloney, who set his tale of the murdering landlord back in Henry I's England. So the paper trail begins 4 centuries after the events it describes, in an entertainment. Folklore scholars who've studied it point out, though, that Deloney was a travelling artisan who worked real local traditions into his stories as he moved around the country, and they suspect he collected this one at Colnbrook rather than inventing it, some memory or rumour already old when he heard it, attached to that building on that road. Where the truth sits along that line, you can decide for yourself, ideally not while spending the night in the room over the kitchen. Paris has the twin of that story, older in its setting and considerably nastier in its commerce, and it comes with an address. The Ile de la Cité, the island in the Seine where Paris began, Notre Dame at one end, and in the medieval street plan, a lane called the Rue de Marmousset, crossing a smaller one called the Rue des Deux Ermites. On that corner, the tradition says, in the 1380s stood 2 shops side by side, a barber and a pastry cook. The pastry cook was famous. His pâtés, his little meat pies were talked about across the city. People crossed Paris for them, and the tradition can't resist adding that the quality reached the very top, that King Charles VI himself was fond of them. The barber next door offered the usual trade, a shave, a haircut, minor surgery, since barbers held the license for blades in that world. And between the 2 shops, down in the dark, their cellars connected. The barber's chair, in the story, stood over a trapdoor. His preferred clients were young men passing through, students especially, and the Ile de la Cité swarmed with students, poor, transient, far from their families, exactly nobody's responsibility. A young man came in off the street for a shave. The razor went across his throat deep, and the chair mechanism dropped him through the floor into the cellar where the man from next door took over. And the man from next door was, professionally speaking, very good with meat. What went upstairs into the pastry shop's ovens after that made the corner famous. Paris, in this telling, ate its own missing students for years, praised the cooking, and came back for more. The discovery, in the tradition, belongs to a dog, a victim's dog that had waited outside the barber's door and would not leave it and howled there day after day until the animal's persistence did what no institution in the city was equipped to do, connect a disappearance to an address. People finally paid attention to where the dog was pointing. The cellars were opened. The trap door and the hatch between the 2 shops were found, and with them the remains of the trade, and the 2 men were taken. The punishment the story hands them fits the era's sense of proportion. Burned alive, both of them, in iron cages according to some tellings, and their houses pulled down to the ground with the plot declared cursed, no building permitted on it for generations. Small ironies have gathered on that ground since. The street was renamed centuries ago. The corner today lies along the Rue Chanoinesse, and part of the old site now serves, of all possible tenants, as a garage for the Paris police. As with Colnbrook, the paper trail wants examining, and here it's even thinner. Nothing from the 1380s mentions any of it, and the criminal register of the Châtelet, our lone surviving casebook from exactly those years, exactly that city, has nothing that matches. The story surfaces in literary form much later. A 19th century novelist retails it as an old Paris affair. A 20th century chronicler of the city's legends gives a full version, and a ballad of contested age carries the plot in verse. The bloodthirsty barber and the reckless pastry cook, discovered by a dog, feeding Christian flesh to the world. So you have a choice with the Rue des Marmousets, the same choice this whole subject keeps offering. A late legend, pure and simple, projected backward onto medieval streets, or a memory that survived outside the documents, in the mouths of a neighborhood for centuries, of something that actually happened on that corner. One detail in the tradition, though, has the ring of the real 14th century regardless. Every telling agrees that the disappearances themselves raised no alarm at all. Students and drifters went missing from the island constantly, the tellers shrug, and nobody counted them. On that particular point, everything else in this video says the legend knows exactly what it's talking about. Everything in this video so far, the acquittal rates, the anonymous roads, the uncounted children of the poor, the machinery that noticed nothing, converges at last on one documented catastrophe in the west of France, and on one man, Gilles de Rais. Start with who he was, since the height of the fall depends on it. Born around 1404 into two of the greatest fortunes in Western France. Orphaned young, raised by a grandfather, Jean de Craon, whose parenting philosophy ran to acquisition and impunity, Gilles came into an inheritance of castles and lands that made him one of the richest nobles in the kingdom. And he made his name in the noblest company imaginable. When Joan of Arc rode to relieve Orléans in 1429, Gilles de Rais fought beside her, one of her companion commanders, through the fighting on the Loire and the push to Reims that put the crown on Charles VII. At the coronation, still in his mid-20s, he was made a marshal of France, the summit of the military profession, hero of Orléans, companion of the saint, marshal of the kingdom. Within about a year, Joan was captured, and in 1431 she was burned. Gilles's war effectively ended, and he withdrew to his own lands, to his castles at Machecoul and Tiffauges and Champtocé, rich beyond sense, 26 years old, and answerable in practice to nobody. What his money did next is documented in the accounts, and it matters for what follows. He spent like a man trying to empty an ocean, a private chapel establishment with dozens of clergy and choir boys, dressed and equipped past the standard of cathedrals. And one production above all, a theatrical spectacle celebrating the siege of Orléans, his own great days. With hundreds of performers, lavish costumes, the audience fed and given drink at his expense, performance after performance. The fortune began to founder. Lands were sold and pawned, and his family petitioned the crown to restrain him. And in his desperation to refill the treasury, he turned to alchemy, and past alchemy, to men who promised results by darker routes. An Italian cleric named François Prelati arrived at Tiffauges claiming command of a demon called Baron, and the invocations began, Candles and circles and offerings in locked rooms of the castle, the Marshal of France kneeling in the dark asking a demon for gold. Prelati would later describe all of this to the judges himself, including the night he offered the demon, in a glass vessel, parts of a child. Because by then, and here the account has to go where the documents go, children had been vanishing around Gilles' castles for years. By his own eventual confession, it began around 1432. The victims were the children of the poor, boys mostly, some girls, roughly 7 to 18 years old, shepherd boys, beggar children who came to the castle gates for alms, the sons of labourers and tradesmen in the villages under his walls. Some were taken by his household men, and the trial names them, the body servants Poitou and Henriette chief among them. And some were gathered by an old woman named Perrine Martin, and the country people had already given her a name before any court did, La Meffraye, the frightener. She walked the roads in grey, by the testimony, a soft-spoken old woman who found children tending animals or begging on the verges, spoke kindly to them, offered food and a better situation at the great house, and walked away with them toward Machecoul. The children who went with her were not seen again. Word of her moved through the countryside the way such things move, sideways, in lowered voices, for years before anyone official heard it. One mother's testimony survives in enough detail to stand for all of them. Her name was Perron Loissard, and she lived at La Roche-Bernard, and in September 1438, Gilles de Rais and his household stopped for the night at the inn across from her house. She had a son, 10 years old, and the lord's man Poitou came to her and made her an offer about the boy. He would be taken into the great household. He would be clothed, looked after, given schooling, set up for a life she could never give him, and she would be paid as well, money for a dress. She was poor. This was, on its face, the best thing that would ever happen to her child. She agreed. She testified later under oath about the ordinary details of that day, that Poitou shorted her part of the promised money and they argued about it, 20 sous over the price of the dress, a mother haggling on her doorstep, doing her best, with no possible way of knowing what she was standing in the middle of. The next morning, the household mounted up and rode out, and her son went with them, and she came out and asked after him, asked the Lord himself as he passed, and got nothing. What she got was Poitou in passing, remarking that the boy had been well chosen, and that he was as beautiful as an angel. Those were more or less the last words anyone ever gave her about her child. He went to Machecoul. He was never seen again. Multiply her. That's what the record from 1440 does. It multiplies her, deposition after deposition, parents from villages scattered across 2 dioceses, each with a date and a place and a last sighting, and a detail in the record that I find almost unbearable. Over and over, the lost children are identified by their parents' names, the son of Jean Janvray, 9 years old, the son of Jeanne de Grepy, 12, the son of Jean Hubert, 14, and on down the list, because the notaries recorded the witnesses, and the witnesses were the parents. The children's own first names, in case after case, are simply gone, never written down. An entire population of murdered children survives in the historical record as somebody's son. And around all these families, for years, The region had known something was wrong. One witness told the court about traveling and mentioning where he was from, and watching a stranger recoil, and hearing the man say that they ate little children there. Machecoul had become a name people flinched at, a rumor with walls, and still, for 8 years, nothing happened, because what was anyone supposed to do? The lord of those children's parents was a marshal of France. Complaining about him out loud near his own castles was a good way to join the missing. The secret, by the late 1430s, was straining at its seams. The land sales meant castles changing hands, and a castle changing hands meant strangers with keys, and by the servant's own later account, the clearing of Champtocé before its new owner took possession, that midnight portage of trunks packed with the remains of dozens of children, was done in haste and terror precisely because discovery had come so close. Whispers moved with the household as it contracted. Villagers kept counting, and still the thing might have run on for years more, because everyone who suspected was poor, and everyone who knew was implicated, a seal that ordinary pressure was never going to break. What finally broke it open had nothing to do with the children at all, and every historian who touches this case ends up shaking their head at the fact. In May of 1440, Gilles, deep in a dispute over a property he'd sold, rode to the church of Saint-Étienne de Mermort during Mass, armed, seized a cleric at the altar and threw him in a dungeon. Kidnapping a priest out of a church put him, at a stroke, inside the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Nantes, and the Bishop, Jean de Malestroit, took the opening and pulled. Through the summer, his officers moved quietly through the villages taking sworn statements, and the statements were about the children, years of them. And in September 1440, Gilles de Rais was arrested at Machecoul and brought to Nantes, into the fortress there, to face 2 courts at once, the Church's court for heresy and the crimes bound up with it, and the Duke's secular court for the murders. The trial that followed generated one of the most extraordinary document sets of the age, and its center of gravity is the testimony of his own household. Poitou and Henriette, the 2 body servants, talked in detail, and their accounts, taken separately, agreed to a degree the notaries recorded almost identically, and what they described was this. The children brought to the private rooms at Machecoul and Tiffauges were assaulted by their lord and were killed, some by having their throats cut, or their heads taken off with heavy daggers and short swords, some by a cudgel blow to the head, some strangled. The killing was slow when he wanted it slow. Both servants testified that he would sit on the bodies of the dying, on their stomachs and chests, and hold himself there to watch their faces while they finished dying, and that with the dead, afterward, he handled the severed heads, held them up, compared one against another for beauty, and kissed the ones he judged finest. And then the household did the housekeeping. The bodies went into the great fireplaces of the castle chambers, burned down through the night, the ash and what bones survived raked out and thrown into the moats and the latrine ditches. Bodies were reduced in batches when there was a backlog. When Gilles left Champtocé for the last time, men carried the skeletal remains of dozens of children down out of a tower in trunks, by their own account somewhere around 40, to be burned elsewhere, out of the new owner's sight. The court asked, of course, for a total. Nobody could give one. Every victim, or nearly, had been rendered into ash and smoke years before, which was the point. The church's final sentence settled on a formula: the murder of 140 children or more, and the honest range historians work with runs from around 80 up past 200. The furnaces at the center of the case guaranteed the count would never close. Gilles himself at first gave the courts nothing. He stood in front of the assembled judges and called them simoniacs and ribalds, refused to answer, refused to recognize them. Excommunication came down. The prosecution's witnesses, the parents, went on, and then the court formally notified him of the next procedural step, that he could be put to torture to move the inquiry along. Faced with that, and by every account genuinely terrified of dying outside the church, he turned completely. The torture never had to be applied. He confessed out of court to the notaries, and then, on the 22nd of October, he confessed again, in open court, publicly, at length, and the record of that day is a strange and awful thing. He gave them everything, the takings, the killings, the burnings, in his own words. And he wept, and he addressed the crowd, the parents among them, and told the fathers and mothers present to raise their children strictly and virtuously, drawing the lesson of his own unbridled youth for them, the murderer of their sons, offering them parenting counsel from the dock in tears, and the room wept with him, because he was performing the one script everyone in that century understood: the great sinner brought to repentance. On the 26th of October 1440, he was taken out with Poitou and Henriette to a meadow on an island in the Loire at Nantes. 3 gallows stood over 3 fires. He asked to die first, so the servants could watch him go and not despair, and spoke to the crowd and prayed, and was hanged as the fire took light beneath him. By special grant, before the flames could do their work, his body was cut down and passed to noblewomen who saw it buried in a Carmelite church in the city, an honor his 2 servants did not receive. The fire kept them. A tradition grew up in Nantes afterward. Parents in later years are said to have whipped their children once a year on the anniversary, so that the memory of what had happened to the children of that country would be beaten into each new generation and never come loose. The rest of the household's reckoning came in fragments. Poitou and Henriette burned entirely on that island, their ashes going into the Loire, servants to the end, even in the manner of dying. Perrine Martin, La Meffray, the grey woman from the roads, was arrested and held in the Duke's hands, and then the record in its way loses interest in her. She disappears into imprisonment, and the country she'd walked for years was left to reckon its missing children against her memory. And François Prelati, the demon summoner, the man who by his own testimony offered a child's remains to a devil in a jar, walked. Condemned by the church court, he was imprisoned rather than executed, escaped or was released within a couple of years, and surfaced in the service of one of the great princes of the realm, charming and employable to the last, until a fresh crime some years on finally put him on a gallows of his own. If you want a single thread showing how this world actually distributed consequences, follow Prelati's, the marshal hanged in 1440, and the man who ran his demon room got a job. The record being what it is, though, I owe you the other side of it, and you should have it exactly as the documents give it. Every conviction in this case rests on words, testimony, and confession. Not one body was produced in court, not one bone. The confession of Gilles himself came under a formal threat of torture and under excommunication from a man visibly desperate to die inside the church, and the confessions of his two servants, the two pillars of the detail, match each other so closely in the notarial record that you can take the similarity either way, as corroboration or as production. And the men running the process were not neutral. The bishop who built the case and the duke whose court tried it stood among the chief beneficiaries of Gilles' ruin. The duke had been buying up the man's mortgaged lands for years and secured the goods and the ground when the fire went out. All of that is in the record too, sitting right beside the parents' depositions. Centuries later, a French writer took that side of the file and ran a full mock retrial in Paris in 1992 with lawyers and former ministers on the bench, and that assembly voted to acquit him, a verdict with no legal force that most medievalists found more theatrical than persuasive, in part for a simple reason. The mock court had answers for the confessions and thinner answers for the mothers. Dozens of them from dozens of villages that had no contact with each other, each with a child who walked toward those castles and never came back. However you finally weigh Gilles de Rais, the disappearances themselves sit in the sworn record, independent of any torture chamber, and nobody has ever explained them away. Where his guilt begins and ends, I'll leave with you. The empty places at those tables were real either way. Step back from Nantes for a minute. The Gilles de Rais file, horrific as it is, answers a question that hangs over this entire video almost by accident. 8 years. Dozens of children, at minimum, from a compact stretch of countryside, with rumor screaming the whole time, and the machine only engaged when the man grabbed a priest. So put it plainly, whose deaths, in this world, actually got counted? Because the answer draws a line straight through medieval society, and everyone in tonight's cast of victims falls on the same side of it. A merchant found dead drew an inquest, a coroner, 50 jurors, a parchment record. His guild asked questions. His family pushed. His property had to go somewhere, and property generates paperwork. Now take the people our killers actually chose, the beggar child at the castle gate, the orphan servant girl 100 miles from any relative, the vagrant laborer walking between harvests, the old woman without family, the sex worker in the town's back lanes. When one of them dropped out of the world, no household reported it, since no household contained them. Employers didn't ask, or were themselves the problem. And an inquest needs a body, a first finder, and a community that considers the death its business, and these were exactly the people no community claimed. Medieval society had a deep floating population, people detached from parish and family and guild, swollen in famine years and war years, migrating for work, begging between towns. Contemporaries guessed at their numbers and worried about them constantly as a nuisance and a menace. Nobody, anywhere, kept a record of them being alive, so no record could notice them being dead. Every predator we've met understood that, whether they could have articulated it or not. La Meffraye walked past the houses of the propertied and spoke to the children on the verges. The choosing was the concealment. One custom made the children of the poor even easier to take, and it was a custom of hope. Medieval families routinely sent children away into service at 7, 8, 10 years old, off to another household, sometimes another town, to work and learn and be fed at someone else's table. And everyone understood that a child gone into service might not be seen or heard of for years. No letters were coming. Nobody involved could write them. So a child who walked away with a stranger toward a promised position raised no alarm anywhere. In every mind that loved him, he was a placed child, provided for, doing well somewhere, right up until the day, years later maybe, that somebody finally went asking. The offer Poitou made on Perron-Lessard's doorstep worked on her exactly there, on the one hope a poor mother had, and the years of quiet around castles like Machecoul ran on the same current. The most efficient way to take a child from a medieval family was to promise it a future. And then, in the middle of our period, came the event that broke even the counting of the counted. The Black Death reached England in 1348, and over roughly 2 years it killed somewhere between 1/3 and half of everyone. Think for a moment about what that did to the very idea of a suspicious death. Villages lost half their names in a season. Towns dug trench pits and layered the dead in by the cartload, 5 deep, a little earth between the layers, because the churchyards were full by spring. Whole households went in a week, with nobody left inside to say who died in what order. The system we spent all that time on, the coroner riding out, the 50 neighbors around one body in a ditch, that system rests on one assumption so basic nobody ever wrote it down, that a dead body is unusual enough to stop for. For 2 years, and again in the return outbreaks that came every decade or so for the rest of the century, that assumption was gone. A corpse was infrastructure. And I'll say this carefully, because no document can confirm it, only the logic of everything the documents do show. A strangled body slipped in among plague dead was beyond any scrutiny that world could offer. If anyone in the pestilence years worked that cover, and the opportunity sat there for months at a stretch across an entire continent, then their victims are folded into the plague's tally forever, and no historian will ever pull them out. The wolf column, again, at continental scale. Poison gets its own moment here too. The medieval record has almost nothing to say about it, and that quiet is the story. Killing with poison defeats every tool this era possessed even harder than the roadside ambush does. A poisoned man takes sick and dies, and sickness was the water everyone swam in. Half the deaths in any parish in any year came with fever and vomiting and purging attached. No test existed, none, to say afterward that a death was arsenic rather than August. Physicians could suspect, and famously did whenever anyone important died at a convenient moment. Medieval chronicles hum with poison rumors around dead princes. But proving it on a body was beyond the science by centuries. Trace the implication down the social ladder. If poison in a duke's dinner couldn't be established with the best physicians in the kingdom crowded around the corpse, then a woman quietly dosing a husband, and then a second husband, and then a lodger in a village nobody famous ever visited, existed entirely outside the reach of detection. Patient domestic poisoning, the classic quiet method of the repeat killer in every later century once chemistry could finally see it, is almost a blank page in the medieval record. Reason tells you the page wasn't blank in life. The record simply had no ink that could mark it. When the age did convince itself it had found poisoners at work in a pattern, the results tell you more about the era's fears than about any actual crime, and one episode from France makes it as dark as anything in this whole story. In 1321, a rumor tore through the south of France that the lepers, the disease-marked poor confined in their hospital houses at the edges of every town, had formed a vast conspiracy to poison the wells and springs of the healthy. Confessions were collected under torture, and the confessions, extracted with fire and the rack, agreed with each other in the way tortured confessions reliably do, growing an enormous plot with powders and payments and foreign masterminds behind it, and the accusations spread to sweep in Jewish communities as well. The crown endorsed the panic, and that summer, across the region, lepers were burned. Rounded up out of the hospital houses and burned in batches, men and women who had already lost everything to disease, killed by their neighbors for a plot that existed in the torture chamber and nowhere else, as historians who have worked through the records describe it, and that carries a hard implication for our subject. This society was fully capable of perceiving a serial poisoning pattern, mobilizing against it, interrogating, convicting, executing at scale. Every part of the machinery worked. It just pointed at the wrong people, at the weakest people in reach, and it was aimed by fear. And confession under torture would validate whatever fear had already decided. The genuine repeat killer, meanwhile, standing in no category anyone feared, drew none of it. The apparatus for hunting monsters existed. Monsters, in the medieval sense, meant the marked, the foreign, the cursed, the dead. It did not mean the ordinary man. So how did this world explain a Gilles de Rais to itself when it caught one? Its formula appears right in the legal paperwork, and once you notice it, it's everywhere. English indictments describe the accused acting at the instigation of the devil, seduced by diabolical suggestion, the phrase as standard in the documents as the date, and it was more than boilerplate. It was the whole working theory of criminal evil. Sin was a universal condition, temptation a universal pressure, and a man who did something monstrous was a man who had stopped resisting, opened the door, let the enemy steer. The court at Nantes framed Gilles exactly that way, and Gilles framed himself that way, tracing everything to his ungoverned appetites and his unbridled youth. And the crowd understood him perfectly, because everyone shared one map of the human soul. And on that map, appetite unresisted led anywhere, including where he went. The consequences of that theory ran deep. If monstrous killing was sin, then any sinner might do it, and no particular sort of person was more likely to. So the idea of watching for a type, a pattern, a profile, had no soil to grow in. The remedy for sin was confession, penance, and punishment of the act. The acts were counted one at a time. The man behind a string of them was, theologically, just a sinner who hadn't stopped. And the response, when he was finally in hand, needed only a rope and a fire, applied once. Unless the man was mad, where the medieval world managed something close to gentleness. English law recognized the furiosus, the frenzied man, the one who killed while out of his senses, and juries took the category seriously. They'd tell the court a defendant had been raving for years, had no memory of the deed, had turned on his own family for no cause in the world. And the customary outcome for such a killer was a royal pardon, with the madman handed back to his kin to be kept, tied if he had to be, in the house he'd bloodied. Cases survive of parents who killed their own children in documented madness, and were pardoned for exactly that reason. Set the two categories side by side, though, and look at what they produce. A killer was a sinner, punished by the act, or a madman, pitied and pardoned. A sane man who killed strangers repeatedly, coldly, for years, because he wanted to, fit neither box, and a mind with only those two boxes, confronted with the evidence of such a man, would sooner reach for wolves, demons, or the walking dead, than accept the ordinary neighbor as the answer, which, as we've seen all video, is precisely what it did. When it did catch one, though, and was sure of him, this world knew exactly what it wanted, and its punishments were designed as carefully as anything it built. English practice for murder was hanging, and by later standards, English hanging was almost restrained. The horror the English added came afterward with the gibbet. A killer whose crime had frightened the county was denied a grave. His body was tarred to make it last, fitted into a cage of iron bands shaped to the body, and hung from a tall post at a crossroads or along the highway near where he'd done his killing, and it stayed there for years, creaking in the wind, picked at, drying out, rattling in its iron through every season. On the road his neighbors used every market day. Children grew up walking past the man in the cage. That was the intent, a lesson installed in the landscape, and travelers' accounts make clear the lesson reached them. approaching a strange town past its gallows and its dangling cages, told you the place kept order, the way a lighthouse tells you about rocks. London's version of the permanent lesson stood out west of the city at Tyburn, where the gallows worked from the 1190s onward, 600 years of continuous operation eventually, and the first recorded customer sets the tone. William Fitzosbert, a demagogue who'd raised the London poor against the rich in 1196, was smoked out of the church he'd claimed sanctuary in, dragged to Tyburn behind a horse, over the road surface the whole way, and hanged in chains. Dragging was part of the sentence, the ground itself administering the first installment. And execution days at Tyburn and its counterparts became, frankly, entertainment. Processions through crowded streets, the condemned given drink along the way, crowds in the thousands at the tree, vendors working them. A society that couldn't investigate death made a festival of punishing it, and the crowd sizes suggest the appetite never once slackened through the entire period. English law reserved one of its worst deaths for a specific domestic killer, and the category maps where the era located its deepest fears about murder in the home. A wife who killed her husband had, in the law's eyes, risen against her lord, and the offence carried its own name, petty treason, tried as a small-scale version of rising against the king. A servant who killed a master fell under the same heading, and the sentence for a woman convicted of it was fire. English records across the period hold cases of wives burned at the stake for husbands dead by knife or, more often by poison, the quiet hearthside method the courts could rarely prove, and so, when they believed they had proof, punished with everything they possessed. Recall the Goldington case from earlier, the wife who let the killers in to take her husband by the fire. Women in her position, when the verdict went the other way, didn't hang. They burned in the marketplace before their neighbours, and the distinction was the whole point. Continental justice built a wider menu, scaled to the crime, and the grading lays out how these societies ranked their horrors. The great German law book of the 1220s, the Saxon Spiegel, and the town codes descended from it, set murder, real murder, secret killing, above ordinary manslaughter, and for murder and for treacherous killing, the punishment was the wheel. It worked like this. The condemned man was staked out on the ground, limbs spread, sometimes with timbers under the joints to give the blows something to break against. The executioner took a heavy wheel, an iron-shod cartwheel, or an iron bar, and methodically shattered the man's limbs, working through the arms and legs, joint by joint, in a sequence and a number of blows. The sentence itself specified, because courts wrote this down, some sentences granting mercy in the form of an early blow to the neck or chest, others ordering the work done from the feet upward, with the man kept alive and conscious through all of it. And when the limbs were pulp, the broken body was threaded through the spokes of the wheel, woven onto it, arms and legs bent through the gaps in ways intact bones would never allow. And the wheel was mounted flat on top of a tall pole and raised up, with the man on it, facing the sky. If the blows had been merciful, he was dead already. If they hadn't, he was alive up there, and stayed alive, in some recorded cases, for days, in the sun and the rain, with the birds arriving long before the end. Crowds attended all of it. The pole stood until the remains fell apart. Fire sat in its own category. reserved across most of Europe for the crimes understood as spiritual contamination, heresy, sorcery, and certain murders that crossed into the unspeakable. And the Paris pastry legend reaches straight for burning and the razing of the houses. The storytellers knew their own legal culture. A crime like that couldn't just be punished, the ground itself had to be cleansed. Several regional codes prescribed drowning or burial alive for certain crimes and certain criminals, and town records here and there preserve sentences of women buried alive under the gallows, a punishment some jurisdictions considered, grotesquely, the modest alternative to hanging a woman where the crowd could see her skirts. Counterfeiters in various places went into boiling water or oil, the cauldron answering the crucible. Every one of these deaths was public, deliberately prolonged, and aimed past the dying man at the crowd, and at the roads, and at the future. The medieval state could not investigate, could barely pursue, and could not prevent. Punishment spectacle was the one lever it truly possessed, so it pulled that lever with everything it had, and the wheels on their poles outside 1,000 towns were the era's entire criminology, compressed into a single message. This is what we do to the ones we catch. The quiet second clause, the one this whole video has been about, went unsaid. If we catch them. Time, finally, to close the ledger. Across 1,000 years of the European Middle Ages, with tens of millions of lives lived and ended, the roster of named recorded serial-style killers comes down to a handful: a marshal of France, a hooked butcher in the Scottish passes, some bandit captains, an innkeeper of doubtful paperwork, a barber in a legend, and a scattering of court entries. Against everything we know about human beings in every other era that kept better records, that number can only be the truth of what was written down. And by now, you can list the reasons alongside me, because we've walked through everyone. Investigation worth the name didn't exist. The coroner counted wounds. He didn't hunt patterns. Jurisdictions never spoke to each other. So 5 bodies in 500s were 5 files that could never touch. Identity was unprovable and unstorable, so distance equaled disguise, and the roads offered infinite distance. The victims most worth taking were the ones no institution counted alive. Wolves, plague, famine, war, and the ordinary murderousness of daily life buried any pattern in noise. And when a pattern did force itself on a community's attention, the community's own map of the world sent the search toward demons, revenants, werewolves, lepers, the marked and the monstrous, everywhere except toward the unremarkable man on the bench by the fire. One more piece completes it, and it explains something you may have wondered about this whole video. If you've ever gone looking for medieval serial killers before, you've probably met names this video hasn't dwelt on: the werewolf of Bedburg, the Hungarian countess in her castle, the German bandit with his hundreds of confessed murders. Look closely at the dates on every one of those cases, and you find the 1500s and the 1600s, after the Middle Ages proper had ended. And the timing has a cause you can hold in your hand: the printing press. From the early 1500s, a horrifying crime generated pamphlets, broadsheets, ballads, cheap illustrated sheets sold at fairs, and executions across whole countries within months. And suddenly a killer could have what no medieval killer ever had: A name that traveled, a story that compounded, a documented legend in his own lifetime. The famous monsters of the early modern period mark the moment Europe acquired the technology to notice, count, and remember such men. Push the same lens back before print, and the names thin out for the simplest of reasons. The paper to hold them never existed, which leaves the medieval ones where they always were, uncounted, unnamed, and in every sense that mattered to them, safe. And if you want a last image to carry out of all this, take the one the records themselves offer, the confessed killer on the Abjura's road. A real figure, remember, repeated hundreds upon hundreds of times across the centuries. A man who has admitted his killing out loud, at a church door, before God and the coroner, sworn his oath, taken his little wooden cross, and set off down the king's highway toward the port and the ship and the exile he has promised. Bareheaded, in his penitent's shift, walking through the villages, and every soul he passes knows exactly what the cross in his hands means. The law watches him to the edge of its sight, and somewhere out past the third village, or the fifth, at dusk, on an empty stretch with trees close on both sides, the road bends, and the figure with the cross isn't on it anymore. No record follows him. Off the highway, out of the parchment, into the same darkness that swallowed his victims, a man with practice, at large in a world with no way to see him coming. The rolls at his back close over his name. Somewhere ahead, an inn is lighting its lamps for the evening trade, and the host is at the door, counting the travellers coming up the road. And that's where we'll leave it. Thank you so much for spending this one with me, seriously. If a particular case stuck with you, the hook in the passes, the dog outside the barber shop, tell me below. I'm curious which of these keeps people up at night. Huge thanks as ever to the patrons and members carrying the channel on their backs. You make every episode possible, and if you'd like to join them, everything's linked in the description and the pinned comment. Sleep well if you can manage it. See you in the next one.